this evening, but we will proceed. Tonight's meeting is being held virtually because of the mandate by the governor. The commissioners know to ask their questions in the chat box and introduce themselves when they speak. For anybody who would like to call in and speak at tonight's meeting, the information is online for you. So first of all, I'm going to ask Kristen to take the roll.
Hi, this is Kristen Leeson. So Commissioner Boyce.
Here.
Commissioner Lewis.
Present.
Commissioner Fall.
Here.
Commissioner Probola.
Present.
And Commissioner Carl has an excused absence this evening.
Is there anybody? So we have 4 members this evening, so we do have a quorum. Is there any staff members that are on this evening?
Yes, we have City Attorney Daniel Kinney, Lucy Sloman, Land Development Manager, Andrea Snyder, who is Deputy City Administrator, and Kristen Leeson, Senior Planner, and Gabe Shelton with staff, IT.
Thank you. Since I'm going blind here, since I'm not in the meeting actually, the first thing on our agenda is the approval of the minutes from the last meeting. Do I have any corrections, concerns, additions to the minutes? Hearing none, the minutes are approved. This evening, we will have a presentation on the requirements that the Supreme Court has mandated in regard to changes and requirements that are in the sign code. I know that a lot of other cities have already worked on this, but this is our start to begin the process to make any changes that is necessary to meet all the requirements that are set by the Supreme Court. So with that, we are having a presentation this evening, and I don't have, Kristen, could you please introduce the speaker tonight?
Yes, our speaker tonight is Daniel P. Kinney. He is one of our city attorneys with Ogden Murphy Wallace.
So if he would like to unmute himself and speak, we would anxiously await hearing what he has to say.
Great. Well, first of all, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. If at any time that changes, just wave your arms or something and let me know. Yeah, exactly. And so I appreciate you having me here tonight. This is actually a follow-up presentation. I'm not sure if everybody was either on the commission or would remember, but the sign code has come to PPC in the past. I don't know the exact date off the top of my head, but I would guess a year to year and a half ago, probably. And it's in process right now. And the goal of the presentation this evening is to really kind of get everybody back familiar with why we're doing a revision to the sign code, and kind of the reasons behind it and what those changes might look like. What you will not have tonight is a draft sign code that will come to you after the new year, and you will work with that sign code given the knowledge that we're going to kind of refresh tonight. And we will then be working on the draft sign code for a period of a couple of meetings in the first quarter of 2021, looking for then a recommendation to go to the city council on adoption of a new sign code. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to share my screen, and I will be providing these slides following the presentation. There was a memo that this largely tracks as well in your packet. And for those on the phone or that don't have video, there's nothing too important that will be on the screen that I won't say as well. But of course, if there's any clarification as a result of that, please let me know. I think I'll have the chat screen open, but if for some reason I don't see a raised hand or a question asked, please feel free to interrupt at any time and ask your question to make sure that we're all on the same page. And then we'll go through questions at the end of the presentation, should there be any, and that'll be our kind of refresher to get us back in line for sign code. Okay, and I was having a little bit of feedback there. Was that on my end, or is anybody else hearing that?
I'm sure it's on my end. I will have to make some changes. I apologize.
Oh, it's fine. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't doing anything with my headset. Okay, so this is my first time on WebEx, so I'm going to hit share and get my screen up. So let's see here. I'm going to pull stuff around so I can see. Can everybody see my PowerPoint that is not yet shared as a presentation? Yes, okay. So let's go to presentation mode and see if it actually plays ball. Can you now see just the presentation, not the little prepared side? Can't see it.
It's
Can
loading.
you? Oh,
Looks
sorry.
like it's loading. I think it errored out.
Oh, interesting. Let
I
me
see your presentation, then I have a gray box that's covering 2/3 of it.
Let's see, maybe. That didn't do it. Yeah. And that is exactly what I did. So let me just back out and do that, because here I thought I was being slick and I was not. Okay, so I think I'm going to see my own picture projected to you. So you can see just the presentation?
Yes, it looks good.
Great. Okay. Thank you for your patience. I have not done WebEx in 7 months. That's the first time I've had to do WebEx. But anyway, okay. So we're going to be talking about the United States Supreme Court case Reed versus Town of Gilbert. And let's see. Okay. So it's funny. I've given presentations on this case for a very long time. This was decided in June of 2015, and I've had to modify this slide over the years because it gets slowly and slowly farther and farther away. It was this new attention-grabbing case, and now it is kind of old news. That's a long time ago. However, there are a lot of cities just like yours that are trying to revise their sign code still. It does take a lot of time and effort to do that, and there are a lot of different priorities out there. It's been a little while, but we're still moving it forward. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go over what the Town of Gilbert's sign code provisions looked like. At the very end, I'm going to pull up some of your sign code provisions to show you some similarities between the two. But the Town of Gilbert, Arizona had sign provisions, and they had the display of outdoor signs without a permit, and then exempted 23 categories of signs. 3 of those that should look generally familiar, because we see them in a lot of sign codes, were ideological signs, political signs, and temporary directional signs. Each of these sign categories or types had different regulations that applied to those signs. So, for example, I'll just look at the size. Ideological signs were 20 square feet. Political signs were 32 square feet. And I think it was 6 feet for the temporary directional signs, and I've got them all put out here. So what that resulted in is all of the different types of signs had different durational limits, different size limits, as you can see on this nice little diagram, that created a discrepancy between the signs. And so what happened is it created a hierarchy. The hierarchy of signs had more restrictions for those temporary directional signs and less restrictions as you went away from that to political signs and then to ideological signs. All of these signs were what I would consider or describe to be temporary non-commercial signs. They were all First Amendment protected free speech. And so what was happening in this case? Why did it ever get to the Supreme Court? It all centered around the Good News Community Church. This is just a small church. They didn't have a meeting location, and they got creative because they didn't have a meeting location, and they would put temporary signs out into the community, 15 or 20 of them, and they put them out on Saturday and then remove them on Sunday, basically just telling people this is where we're going to be having our services this week. And it was their way to communicate with their churchgoers. And they basically just communicated the name along with the location of the upcoming service. So, fairly benign when you think about certainly the quantity of sign, not that many signs were out in the community, and the duration, they put it out early on Saturday and moved them midday on Sunday. So we're not talking about months on end. And so there's a saying amongst lawyers that, about bad facts make bad law. This is kind of your prime example of bad facts because this is real simple stuff. But what happened is that they got cited. The church was cited 2 times for violations of the sign code. First, for exceeding time limits for displaying that sign. And second, for again doing that and not including the date of the event. And so, again, pretty benign citations here. They probably just exceeded it by a little bit amount of time. And what the court looked at was, and mind you, again, that this made its way all the way to the United States Supreme Court. But in Gilbert, Arizona, the sign regulations, in order to understand those restrictions that would apply to any sign, you had to look at the content of the sign. And if you think back on those categories in the hierarchy that we saw and that I described, temporary directional signs, political signs, ideological signs, along with others, all had different regulations depending on what was written on the sign. Not where the sign was located or how it was constructed or whether it blocked a road. It was all about, was it a temporary directional sign? If so, then here's your regulation. Or political, here's your regulation. And they were all different. And so the signs were treated differently. And so in that situation, on its face, the sign code was a content-based regulation of speech. And so that's the key phraseology, is content-based regulation of speech that we're going to continue to talk about, and that became the focus of this United States Supreme Court case. And so I'm going to talk just very briefly, kind of some legal stuff. Don't worry about it. But this is just kind of the reason why we care about it. When you have something that is content-based, in other words, when you treat something differently based upon the message that it's saying, that is then presumptively unconstitutional, and the government has to meet a test, which is called strict scrutiny. It has to be narrowly tailored to serve a compelling government interest. This is a very, very challenging scrutiny to go through. It's typically always fatal. It's very, very, very hard to get through. And so when you find yourself in a position of having content-based regulations, you also find yourself in a position of being susceptible to legal risk and having that legal risk being very challenging for the city to overcome. The other side of this, the kind of the next layer down, is intermediate scrutiny, and this is time, place, manner restrictions. So we are not regulating based on the content, we are regulating based on things like time, place, manner. So the time or duration that it's in a particular location or how it is put up, but you're not looking at the content. So you remove that content-based restriction component. You still have to justify it. The government can't just do anything. And the intermediate scrutiny must be content neutral. Again, that content component is being removed. It must be narrowly tailored to serve a significant government interest as opposed to compelling. Again, kind of a legal distinction, but it is a level down. You must leave open ample alternative channels for communication. Don't worry about these two tests. I only put that there to just show that when you do have content-based regulation, it's a very challenging level of scrutiny. And when you don't have it, that scrutiny drops down to a more manageable level. So that's the only purpose. Don't worry about the legal stuff. And so when the town of Gilbert, Arizona had this legal challenge, they put forward reasons, those government interests, to substantiate their restrictions, their content-based restrictions. And they put forward both aesthetic reasons and traffic safety reasons. Those are two justifications that, as a municipal attorney, I see all the time as reasons for different government regulation. But when the court was analyzing it, the reality was the content of the sign had nothing to do with either the aesthetics of the sign or the traffic safety, because it could have been physically the exact same sign as a political sign, but wouldn't have been allowed because of the content on the sign. And so they weren't able to meet the town of Gilbert, Arizona was not able to meet its burden to prove that it went past that strict scrutiny level, that very, very challenging level of scrutiny. And so what we need to think about is when we're revising your sign code, we need to make sure that we have proper justification for all of the restrictions that we have. And then, of course, assuming we do not have content-based restrictions, that level of scrutiny is lower, though still does exist. And so what I've tried to do in these presentations is boil this all down into a kind of a rule. And so the rule, and I'll read it from the screen for everybody, it's if, when regulating speech, the regulation is split into categories which require you to look at the content of the sign, and those categories are treated differently, that regulation is content based on its face and must withstand strict scrutiny. And I gave a presentation on this to the Code Enforcers annual conference a few years back. And that was the perfect group to talk to this about, because it was easy to tell them, if you're going out and you're doing code enforcement and you see a sign and you wonder to yourself, is that a code compliant sign or not? If you have to read the sign, that's content-based regulation, and it's going to be very problematic. Or if you don't have to read the sign and you're able to apply the city's sign code to it in your code enforcement, then you should be fine in terms of strict scrutiny. So that's the general rule. And I think we'll keep that in mind as we're doing our work on the sign code to make sure that the content of that sign that we're looking at doesn't get brought up in the context of what we're looking at for regulations. So I'll just go back real quick. So when we're thinking about this, and there are legal nuances to this case, as one would probably assume, and one of those is that the case dealt exclusively with non-commercial signs. So when you looked at those categories that were listed, political signs, temporary directional signs, things like that, those are non-commercial. Commercial speech, on the other hand, is regulated with a different level of review, it is less protected compared to First Amendment free speech. So our personal right to express ourselves through politics or religion or about really any topic, that is First Amendment protected, whereas commercial speech, McDonald's right to have their, golden arches put out in front of their business, that is certainly still protected, but it is at a lesser degree. And so we will, in the sign code, the draft, have regulations for commercial speech and for non-commercial speech, one of which will be a little bit more restrictive than the other. And that, frankly, most sign codes already had that. But when we think about content-based regulations, we are primarily looking at the non-commercial speech, and we will still be using those principles when it comes to the commercial speech, but it will be just a bit less of a focus. And so some additional considerations. So the city has quite a bit of regulation on signs throughout different areas of different standards in the city. Your municipal code has the sign code included in there. That's IMC 1811. You also have the Old Town Design Standards, Central Issaquah Development Standards, Rowley Development Agreement, along with others. And I'm going to pull a couple of those up on the screen. And the goal of the city in this revision is going to be, number one, to address the content neutrality that we talked about earlier, that primarily touches on provisions of your code that have regulations based on the content. And then you're also going to be looking to consolidate some of these standards into one unified sign code, so that when people come into the city looking to install a sign, they're not trying to figure out which of a few different sets of standards apply to them. There would be one. And so it's consolidation as well. And so the next steps for PPC is that staff will be bringing to you a draft sign code that we've been working on. It will be presented to you after the first of the year. You will have, I would think, probably at least a couple of touches with the draft sign code. And so with this kind of primer on why we're here and what we're going to do, we'll then walk through what that sign code looks like and talk through the provisions. There is a good chunk of it that's going to look familiar to a lot of people. It's coming from some of those existing sources. And then there's a portion of it that is going to look different because we had to revise it to make it compliant with the content neutrality rules that we just talked about. And so you'll have the opportunity to get familiar with the new code, provide your input, and then our hope would be that you would be able to make a recommendation to City Council in Q1 of next year on the draft sign code, and then City Council will then have the opportunity to consider it and move it forward. And so that's the end of my presentation. And so what I'm going to do, since I actually can't see anybody, I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. So I can see if there's been any questions piling up or anything. Okay.
So I don't see any comments or questions in the chat.
Great. And so let's see.
Does anybody have any comments? Oh, there's a question from Commissioner Lewis.
Yes.
Thank you, Joan. Commissioner Joy Lewis here. I actually have about 5 questions, but I'm going to kind of go round robin because I think this is such a nicer way to do a discussion when we're kind of just getting information. I loved this homework assignment this week because it made me read the Supreme Court decision and all the different opinions that were put forth. And I kind of wanted to make sure that I was understanding that while this was specifically addressing the temporary directional signs, it's farther reaching. And so we're talking about non-commercial signs. Does this also apply to our sign code for commercial signs as well? Are we redoing that as well?
So great question. The holding in Reed, I would view as not being applicable to commercial signs.
Okay.
However, that does not mean that the principles that were applied in that case wouldn't be applicable. And so what I've just used kind of, the absurd as an example. We're not going to have certain regulations for bakeries that are different than coffee shops or what have you. You know, that is content based, and so the levels of scrutiny might be different because it is commercial speech, which has lesser protections. But we still aren't going to pick and choose who gets more speech or easier speech. That's with all that said, the commercial regulations that we will have in the draft sign code will very much largely mirror provisions that are in existing code or standards for the city. And so we are not going to be redoing, you know, all of the marquee sign regulations for the city.
Okay.
We will be pulling together some standards that in some situations may look a little different depending on the source for a different area in the city. And so this group, along with staff, we will synthesize those in the best way possible for the community. But the baseline and what we're working with will largely be unchanged.
Okay. I loved the idea of saying if I need to read the sign, then it's content based and therefore not legitimate, right? I like that idea of having, to me, that's a really good way of kind of looking at it. And I was curious specifically about our code in terms of timing specific signs. So a good example of that we just went through an election, right? So you put up signs specifically for a purpose and a period of time. But the way that I was reading it was that time-based is now wrong, you know, so that basically if you're able to put that sign up for that particular purpose, then it can be up all year long. Is that how do you can you help me clarify kind of the specific nature of what we're allowed to do as far as a time duration example for signs?
Yeah, so you're touching on actually a little bit of a problematic area, particularly in Washington. So Washington has Washington case law that protects political speech and the durations for signs related to political speech. Now, you layer that with the United States Supreme Court decision that says that we can't regulate based on content. That means that whatever we have to do in Washington for political signs, we really have to do for all signs because we can't look at the political sign and treat them different. And so when we have these compounding effects of state case law and federal case law, what it essentially means, in my view, is that the durational limits are going to be a challenge. What we've had the draft that we're working on attempts to address that and tries to put, for example, for the temporary signs, which it frankly is where most of this comes up, puts a limit on how long those signs can be up that can be extended to a period of time that would be reasonable for no matter what type of temporary sign it is, that we think would be workable under the law. But it is a challenge. I mean, you've touched on a key point that is challenging.
Thank you, Mr. Kenny.
I have a question from Commissioner Fall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this is Commissioner Fall. And to thank you, Joy. You actually hit one of my questions as well, talking about the Supreme Court case there. In discussing commercial signs, there is a retailer that we have here in town that I see that has two signs out in public view. They're I'm not sure what they call them, TP signs. They're the fold-up signs, very temporary.
Like an A-frame?
Yeah, A-frame. Thank you.
Sure.
How does that impact? How does that fall into this conversation? I mean, are they allowed to have that up for indefinite because it's up every day for the last several weeks? I think probably because of COVID. But where does that particularly fall into this conversation? How would we treat them?
Well, so I mean, it falls directly in the middle of our conversation. So that will be something that we will all be talking about. And temporary commercial signs have a home in the sign code, just like other types of signs, as do A-frames. And the draft that we're putting together, and again, not ready for you yet, but we'll have allowances for size and construction and setbacks of where it would be placed for signs of that nature, so that we could ensure that it is placed in a location that is safe for pedestrians and cars, that doesn't get in the way of ADA accessibility, for example, isn't too tall so people can see over it and things like that. And for commercial signs, the idea would be that they would be placed in locations that are either on private property or in that close proximity to the business, but in the right of way. And that would be your typical A-frame that has the daily drink specials or something like that, or open and what have you. And so, yes, that is absolutely something that will be part of this and that we'll be looking at, and we want to make sure that we take into account. That's certainly a valuable tool for small business in particular, to communicate with the public about that business. And so the goal absolutely would be to facilitate the businesses in the community and utilizing what's available to them in the sign code, but also protecting the aesthetics and the safety of the community when those signs are out.
Okay, thank you.
So we have a clarification, I guess it's a comment from Commissioner Boyd.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner Boyce here, and thank you, Mr. Kenny. So, because this is a refresher course, the way I heard your presentation is basically a political sign. And I want to thank my fellow commissioners because they basically asked my question, but I'm going to ask this anyway. So if you have a political sign that's within the regulations, and to Commissioner Lewis's point, if you have to read it in order to understand it, that's where you're saying the discrepancy is right now. Technically, you wouldn't be able to take it down a month after an election. And that's where you're saying the problem arises with the Supreme Court, is because if you can't impose a time limit on all content-based signs, you can't do it just for the hierarchy like you had in your graph. It has to be the same regardless, which means somebody could be running for Congress all year round. Is that kind of what I'm understanding?
So, generally speaking, yes. I guess the clarification that I would say is we will have durational limits, but what we won't have is you can only have political signs 60 days before election and 5 days after election. We wouldn't have something that's written like that, but all temporary signs may have a 60 days for the original authorization plus 2 additional 60-day allowances or something like that.
And then what happens? Sorry to interrupt. So what happens to those directional ones, like in Gilbert for the church? If they just, because ideally they would be able to have those same time limits, right? So now the church that met on November 12th, it's December 12th, and they're saying, hey, we don't have to pick up our signs. We have, this time allotted for us.
Yes, I mean you've touched on something we actually talked about a little bit earlier today, and we have in the past is, could somebody run for the next election today, and have that be a year or 2 years, 4 years away or something like that.
Awful.
And there's not a whole lot that we can do about that, because there are situations where somebody will want their name out there at a different time frame, and we can't say. We definitely can't say you can't run for office now, or you can't, put yourself out there in a political sense, because it's not 60 days or whatever, 120 days before an election. And so what we're trying to do is remove those judgments, not judgments in a bad way, just judgments on what the sign says and how it should be treated out of the equation, and look more to all of the things about making sure that it's maintained and in good quality. And I think for a lot of temporary signs, though not all, but a lot, that'll get a lot of them off the street, where they're placed, and then having the durational limits that's not related to the event, but that would apply to all the signs, and making sure that they are actively engaged in that sign. And if they're not, then they wouldn't come in for that next extension. And so you could have possibly signs that would be located out there longer than their useful timeline. You know, if they truly are putting something out that they don't need it after 3 days, there is a chance that that sign could be out there longer than those 3 days only. And you know, you'll see in the draft code, there's a structure that we're still working on, and we will present to you in more final form. But for an application for temporary signs, that would be through the internet, and they would put in information about their sign. And one of the things that could be included in there is the requested duration that would be noted in the system with the approval. And then that way, you know, if you don't need all 60 days, you could put in 5 and then you could go take it down. And so part of it is people using the system and using it properly.
Yeah, and I get that, and hopefully people will be good citizens. One other thing, Mr. Kinney, is so I understand the statute right, coming from the Supreme Court. So if we have a large banner, and regardless of what it says, that wouldn't be content-based, because you would know, okay, that's just inappropriate in the right-of-way right next to Boehm's pool, right? You having a 25-foot banner, you don't really need to look at the content. You just say, well, what is that?
Yes.
And that would immediately go to intermediate scrutiny. It wouldn't be strict scrutiny.
So 2 points on that. Number one, what you described is a situation. There can be prohibited sign types, and there can be restrictions on signs. For example, banners is a great one. I anticipate banners not being allowed across the right-of-way, and so they wouldn't stretch across streets, as one example. And so that would be one example. The other example would be banners, in a parking lot or against a structure, and that would have, size, length, size of font on it, securing it properly so it doesn't become a flight risk, literally, and things like that. That would be that intermediate scrutiny that would be much easier for the city to get by, because, like you said, we don't care if it's the local swimming club or if it's a bakery that has the banner, as long as it's no more than 10 feet long, no more than 15 square feet in size, and is secured or something like that.
Okay, and then my final question, and I'll yield, is as far as private property is concerned. So I'm thinking of Issaquah, Hobart, and I know there are different regulations as far as being incorporated and whatnot, but private property, because we saw a few of those political signs heading out to Highway 18. Is that under the city's purview, even though it's in the right of way? I wouldn't think so, right? That's private property. They can put, a huge sign out there like they did political signs that were out there for the last couple months. And that, even if it's on private property within the city limits, is that a different story?
So the sign code does apply to private property. And again, we're going to try to draft something that treats that sign just like any other sign that they may want to put on their property, of different sign physical characteristics. I would say that probably there's some more leniency when you're on private property, but generally speaking, the sign code applies when those signs are visible to the general public, utilizing the rights of way and streets and sidewalks and whatnot. It would not apply, of course, in your home or inside a business when you can't see it. It might apply to an outward facing sign that's in a window to a business. You see, the easiest example is bars. They tend to fill their windows with neon lights or, paintings or whatever, pictures. Those things would be covered by the sign code. But, for example, a QFC parking lot is going to have, the QFC monument sign up front. It's going to have the QFC on the building and everything. That's certainly a, different example, but it's equally on private property and equally covered by the sign code, as would somebody that wants to put up signs into their front yard. Just because it's your front yard doesn't mean you can put up, 2x4s with big, plywood, 40-foot sign for your favorite political candidate. It would still be covered.
Well, it's good to know. All right. Thank you, Mr. Kinney. Appreciate it.
I have a comment from Lucy Sloman. Are you there?
Hi, I am. Thank you. Daniel, before we start any panic in town, There are city-owned banners that are erected over right-of-way for events such as Salmon Days. And I don't think we have to go into all the details, but I wonder if you could speak to the distinction, because I just don't want people concerned that some of the favored institutions are going to disappear through the change of the sign code.
I appreciate the opportunity to clarify. So I think there's two clarifications there. The first one, that's the quickest and simplest, is that the draft as it currently exists does have a banner permit, and the city will have particular locations with a particular permit to make that allowance available for some of those type of situations. And so I apologize for not clarifying that earlier, but yes, that's absolutely available. And then on a related note, though slightly different, government speech is a whole separate beast, if you will. And so when we think about signs in the right of way, a lot, aside from the political signs, most of the things that you think about aside from that are going to be government speech. So street signs, stop signs, any sort of cautionary thing, all of those are I don't want to say exempt from the sign code, but they're just not covered by the sign code. Those are all put forward by the city. There's no regulation of that. There's no, aside from the city code and what by law needs to happen. And so when we think about, we got to make sure, that we have these signs or anything, all the government stuff is kind of in its own world. And so we don't need to worry about that. And that could include things like, the pennants that would go on the side of a light pole or something like that, that the government would put out for, voting or whatever it may be. That's going to be treated in its own category.
So thank you for the question, Lucy, because that's exactly what I was going to ask. I had these horrible feelings of all of the signs that go down Front Street, all the banners would be illegal, and that would just be awful. I do have a clarification. When you say if you have to read it, give me an example between a sign that you don't have to read that's legal and one that you have to read.
Well, I mean, so the easiest example is if there, excuse me, if there is a political sign set of regulations and you have to read the sign to see whether it's a political sign or it's a temporary directional sign or a McDonald's sign or anything else, that's how that's the reading that I'm talking about. The other way to look at it is this particular sign located too close to the traveled portion of the right of way? Or is this sign too tall? Or is this sign made out of a material that it's dilapidating? There's a lot of qualities to signs that those time, place, manner restrictions would look at that you would never have to say to yourself, is this a political sign? Or you really wouldn't, what is printed on the sign wouldn't matter at all. The closest you're going to get to that with a time, place, manner restriction, and the code has this in some different places, is the size of the text on a sign. And there's a lot of safety reasons why you would want font and text to be of a certain size or less than a certain size, depending on what audience, whether it's cars or pedestrians, it's going for. But you still wouldn't need to read it. You would just need to look at the quality of the sign to understand whether certain regulations apply.
So, Joan, just to add on to Daniel's explanation, I think, where the concern comes from is if you have a political sign, Joanne Smith is running for dog catcher, and you have a Barney's Re-Roofing Company, which is a commercial sign, and then you have an open house for a real estate sign. And if each of those have different regulations, because they're different types of signs, political, real estate, commercial, that's where you have to read the sign to know which kind of regulations apply, and that's what we're not allowed to do anymore. Does that make more sense?
Kind of. I know it's going to be very difficult to put this all together. I've been looking through this for the last couple years with the realtors because they started a long time ago, and I know that every city has been working on this and having problems coming up with a valid, consistent series of, or an ordinance to accommodate all this. And I think it's going to be very difficult to get everything put together. Do you know of any other city that's actually gone ahead and approved it? And is it something that would fit into Issaquah? Lucy.
So I'm going to actually, Daniel is the sign guru from Ogden Murphy Wallace. He's probably too shy to say that. And so I'm going to let him answer because I know of several communities, but he'll have a more comprehensive understanding of which cities have adopted regulations.
Yeah, so other cities have, and cities have taken a lot of different paths with this. Some cities did a very, very light touch and just tried to edit their way out of the situation. Those were a number of the cities early on. There are some cities that took the super heavy touch and just cut basically everything out or apart. And then there are some cities even that went in a totally different direction and tried to create locations for temporary signs and create kind of zones and say everything goes here or there. There's merit to all of those different ways to do it. I think the benefit of what Issaquah is doing is Issaquah identified a need to do some other stuff at the same time. Nothing hugely overhauling, but trying to consolidate. And so the opportunity is available to spend the time, a little bit of time on it. And so what will be put forward is what I would view from a temporary sign perspective as more of a comprehensive look at it and to make sure that it works for the city as opposed to trying desperately to stick to what you have and then just edit out. And if you'd like, I can pull up on the screen an example from your code of some of the sections that we're talking about that are problematic and just how hard it is to work with current structure and needing to move away from that. But yeah, many cities have done it, and many cities have done it in different ways.
So Daniel, I think Joan was also interested because she said she'd been looking at this, maybe some examples of other communities who, I don't know if anyone's taken the approach that we have that you could identify, or I don't think the editing our way out of the paper bag is probably a good technique. And we are going, as a community, we tend to care a lot about our aesthetics and therefore want to regulate things. So I don't know if you have, excuse me, some example communities in the Puget Sound, greater Puget Sound area that you might identify for people who want to just go look at some sign codes that have been adopted.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I can follow up with some more specifics, but City of Olympia is one that I actually worked with them on, and they spent a long time. They had a very involved and detailed community outreach process. So I think that they have a code that I think that they were pleased with when it was adopted. One that is different than that is Gig Harbor. I think it was Carnation did one kind of early on that was pretty comprehensive, but I can follow up with more examples and provide links to those as well.
Before we get into really looking at the Issaquah changes or where they want to go, it would be nice to be able to have some background with some other ideas from other cities to see if we can, incorporate them if we don't like them or something. I do have a question from Commissioner Lewis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner Joy Lewis here. Joan has a perfect segue into my questions, actually. So in my research, so after I read the concurrent opinions, I think it was Justice Alito and Justice Kagan, I was like ready to dive in, right? But our packet is like, wait, it's still coming. So then I, was kind of chomping at the bit. So I really love a lot of the things that Olympia does, the structure that they do. So I liked looking at them. Carnation was another one because they were early on, right? We're kind of behind, so we kind of get to use these models of other communities that have done it. I think Lacey might have been one that I found too that I actually really liked. So I recommend that one. On a separate note, kind of going off of that, I couldn't find anything for our sister cities as far as like Bellevue and Sammamish goes. Not to say that they haven't done it, but I was curious if there was some sort of intent as far as kind of an idea of multiple, having a flow as far as these multiple communities, as far as like a tone or things, or if it was just kind of more of a bubble. But I hadn't seen anything again from our sister communities.
I actually don't think I know off the top of my head about either Bellevue or Sammamish. I'm just trying to think. I did work with Wenatchee on their sign code. Again, I think they would readily admit this. They have some challenges with signs. If you've ever driven down some of the main drags in Wenatchee, they've got a lot of billboards and big pole signs and whatever. So it's very important to them. A pretty detailed process there. But some of the larger communities, like a Bellevue and stuff, it's a little bit slower to get to it. So yeah, I can't speak to those though.
Okay, good. That was what I had kind of figured out since I kind of went in that direction. Speaking very vaguely, how big is this lift for Issaquah? Like, how much does our current sign code need to be amended, right? Like, I like, Lucy's comment about saying we're not trying to edit our way out of a damn paper bag kind of a concept. So I like that. I like that we're digging our teeth in. I'm kind of curious, like, how would you characterize the lift we have in front of us?
That's an interesting question. I've never received a question quite like that. Well, I would say that when it comes to your temporary sign section, the lift is larger because you have a different structure. I mean, just how it was crafted before that doesn't withstand scrutiny, so it needs to look different. And so that lift is larger. For the remaining portions of the code, some of the more administrative type sections of the code, and then the permanent commercial type signs, that lift is smaller because we don't have to recreate anything, but probably not the smallest, just simply because we have 4 or so different codes that we're trying to pull together. And so it's just a lot of data to be working with. But I don't think it's anything overly large in that situation. So in terms of what you'll be working with, I think that you could view it as, there's established city policy and kind of some directive behind a huge portion of what you'll see. So I don't think you'll need to think about like, oh, should we have marquee signs that look like this? I think there's pretty established, precedent that would happen, but it will be before you, and you'll be able to dive as deep as you want. But then that temporary sign section will be one that you'll spend more time thinking about the deeper details.
I just add on to that for a sec. One, I would say we didn't want to create a lot of non-conforming signs, so we will be, as we're trying to get to the single sign code, trying to make sure that if we're making a change, it's intentional and we're aware where we might have nonconformities. And the second thing I just wanted to offer was I know the planning directors at Bellevue and Sammamish, and I'm happy to reach out and find out from them what they've done. It's a good question.
I appreciate that idea of streamlining. I'm curious, so that basically, we're touching this effectively once or, ish, have we encountered any pushback in the last 5 years as we've had this outdated sign code? Have we faced any kind of issues with citations, anything, as we've encountered members of our community because of being out to date?
Not that I'm aware of. I will add, though, that the further away from the Supreme Court decision we are, the more we have lightened our touch on certain kinds of code enforcement to ensure that we are not crossing that line. So I know that there are signs that have temporary signs that are not commercial or fall into the non-commercial category that violate the code, and we have not touched them because we feel that under a code that was compliant with the Supreme Court, they would have been allowed, and therefore we're just remaining silent.
Thank you, guys.
Is there a time limit to when you have to be in conformance?
No. No. I mean, you can be. What we don't want, we're moving towards it. The city's taken steps and has for quite some time to deal with this. So I think all the right things have been done. What we don't want is somebody to, choose to challenge it as applied or on its face, and we won't get into that. But I think that we're looking to get this done in the first part of the year, and I think that there's great support in the administration to get it done, and we'll have a compliant sign code in Q1 2021.
Well, and to add on to what Daniel's saying, which I think is important, is those signs that we're leaving in place. Because we would have to apply the current code using content. It means that we don't have the tools to locate where they're located, how long they're there, and what they're made of. The three things that we do get to regulate. And so we want the tools that allow us to implement the community's expectations as allowed by law.
I mean, that's a good path to follow. I was normally, sometimes when the Supreme Court or the state comes down, they mandate that it has to be done by a certain date. So obviously that's not what is happening now. One of the areas that started out in the beginning of this was Newcastle. And their original idea was to have the zones that you could put signs in, which for as many signs as you wanted, as long as they were in that specific zone. And that would have meant that typically realtors could put in 10 or 15 signs in the same area. So hopefully they've gone a little bit further and not, even the realtors were against that one. I have a question from Commissioner Fowle.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So, Mr. Kennedy, I'm thinking back to a time here in Issaquah when there was an apartment complex, a specific apartment complex that had 8 or 9 different signs advertising their apartment complex along Newport. Can the city prevent or restrict signage in certain areas and the number of signs to a specific, within a certain distance, so that we don't end up with a corner or a street that's junky with signs?
So I think the answer to that is yes, and we've tried to come up with ways to do that are fair and even for everybody that wants to use the sign code. One of the things that we've tried to do is, well, two of the things. we tried to include setback requirements from key features, like from sidewalks, from the road, from driveways, from access points and front doors, things like that, to try to make sure that you still have usability of those areas. And then we've also included right now, which is open for discussion and for further analysis, but having a setback between temporary signs of 5 feet. And so that you don't, what we don't want to have happen, which is what you've identified, is the creation of walls of temporary signs because they're stacked up next to each other and you get, 5 feet, 20 feet, whatever it may be, of just straight signage. And that can be dangerous for pedestrians and cars. And so by requiring a setback, we're not saying, between your signs or any qualification. It's just they need to be set apart for safety of the community. And so things like that, I think, would have the incidental effect of also helping maintain the aesthetics of some of these communities for corners and whatnot. We do have the ability to prohibit signs in some locations, medians, divided roads, things like that. And again, I'm not going to dive too deep into the legal stuff here because we're at too high of a level at this moment. But banning signs from some locations would be infringing upon what's called a traditional public forum, and we can't take away somebody's right to express their free speech in some locations. Again, it's not everywhere. In the middle of a median or a roundabout or something like that. That there's safety reasons and it was never opened up as a public forum, et cetera, et cetera. So we won't get into that, but there's some limited opportunity to prohibit some signs, but I don't want that to be viewed as kind of a tool for this group because we won't be going through and saying, well, we just don't want signs on all corners or something like that. So we'll find ways to address the concerns related to the aesthetics and the safety and the clutter that we can get to in other ways.
Okay. Thank you very much. You answered my question.
So I've been reminded by Senior Planner Lisa that we should introduce ourselves every time we speak. And starting with me, I'm Joan Probola. Is there anybody else who has a question, concern, comment?
I believe this is Lucy Sloman, Land Development Manager. Jason Voice has indicated he had another comment.
Oh,
You,
I
Ms.
think it's
Thank you, Commissioner Voice here. So I just wanted to make a quick comment since we're just kind of talking about this. You had mentioned earlier kind of about a light hand, a heavy hand, and then also like the zoning where you just put a bunch of signs. So for what it's worth, I think the zoning one, I would love to see pictures of that because I'm sure it just looks awful. I'm thinking of like a neighborhood. Again, I keep thinking of Bowen's Pool here in right next to where I live, and I couldn't even imagine if that was just that whole front yard just covered in signs. So many signs that there's 30 real estate people trying to show an open house, and they're all in the same spot. So I would think zoning would probably be the worst option. And I don't know, like I said, for what it's worth, zoning, that one seems to me the scariest one. And then I can understand also, like you said, the right of way and keeping them away for sidewalks, because we all know that sometimes people take them out and throw them. So I don't know, all those things kind of come into play when we're talking about what it is we want to see from our sign code. I'm not sure how far you guys have got into the work, Mr. Kenny and your colleagues, but I don't know, zoning, I'd love to see some pictures of it because I'm pretty sure that probably looks terrifying for what it's worth.
So this is Daniel Kenny. We're not headed down that path right now. Of course, staff and PPC and council may change that, but no, we're not heading down that path, and we feel like we've started to pull together a collection of time, place, manner restrictions that are taking into account the aesthetics and the beauty of your community, but also the right of individuals to utilize the sign code and to put signs out. So we're going to try to find that balance with your help.
So this is Commissioner Probola. I would hope that since we're bringing up real estate signs, that if there are any questions and you need some answers, that you would be able to speak with the realtor organization to make sure that, you know, you're working together. I'm concerned that once this goes into effect, there's got to be some lead time in order for people to understand and see the differences of what's going on. So you're not going to go up and pick up the signs the next day. You're going to inform the people for a relatively short amount of time on what the new conditions are and where we're going with this. I hope that's in the plan. So I don't see any more comments in the chat room. Any of you want to make any additional comments? Is there any comments from Deputy Commissioner Snyder? Hearing none. We are looking forward to did I hear?
I'm sorry. This is Deputy City Administrator Andrea Snyder. I just wanted to make sure to say a few things regarding city updates before you conclude the meeting, but I think we weren't at that point yet. So I just wanted to make sure I said that before you may have moved to conclude the meeting. Thank you.
No, I understand. I was just wondering if you had anything. This is Commissioner Probola. If you had any comments in regard to the sign code. I know it's going to be a robust discussion. Hopefully our new commissioners will be here to join us. There will be 3 new commissioners coming on that I'm really excited about. With that, I'm just going to thank Mr. Kenny and thank you for your time and your answering all your questions this evening. We really appreciate it. Look forward to hearing from you and Lucy again and I hope we get more than one meeting because it is a complicated situation and there's questions that we all will definitely come up with once we see the plan that the city puts together. So thank you, Mr. Kenny.
Thank you for having me.
And with that, I'm going to call on Deputy Administrator Snyder for any comments that she has in regard to some of the other issues that we've spoken about.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm wondering if, before we do that, if we do have any members of the public who wanted to provide comment. I don't know if they've already been provided the opportunity, but certainly I would yield to any members of the public who had a comment if that's appropriate at this time.
I was going to wait until we finish this and we went through the calendar, and then I would open it up to audience comments. So right now, I would appreciate if you would give us your update. For all I know, if there is anybody who would like to make a comment, they might make a comment on what you're going to update us on.
Great. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Again, this is Andrea Snyder, the Deputy City Administrator, and just a couple of announcements for the Commission. First is I wanted to provide an update to you on the construction hours item that you considered at your last Commission meeting. So this was a discussion point as to what constitutes construction in the city's code, and that there was a presentation by our Code Enforcement Officer, Chris Grabowski, on this to you last time. So this item is going before Council's consideration on Monday's regular meeting at 7 o'clock. So if you would like to watch or listen in, it's on regular business for the City Council's consideration. We've certainly included in the Council materials your discussion, the summary of your discussion, and also your recommendations. So that is going before Council on Monday, and I'm happy to circle back with you at our next meeting or beforehand, pending Council's discussion, to let you know how that went at City Council in case you don't have the opportunity to watch on Monday. The other announcement that I wanted to make is that Community Planning and Development Director Keith Niven, I don't think that this announcement has been made to you yet. He is leaving the city. His last day is actually tomorrow, which is one of the reasons why he's not with us this evening. Keith had served the city for a long time, 22 years, and we certainly thank him for his service. And while Keith is, after Keith leaves and before we're able to fill the position, I'll be serving as the interim Community Planning and Development Director in addition to my regular duties. So, but we are hoping to recruit for this position and move quickly on filling this very crucial role for the city. But I wanted to make sure that you all knew that tomorrow is Keith's last day. Those are all of my announcements and updates. Madam Chair, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak.
You are taking on a huge responsibility. I don't know how you have time to accomplish all that is on your plate. I do have a comment from Senior Planner Lisa.
Hi, this is Kristen Leeson, Senior Planner. I do have, Andrea got, Deputy City Administrator, got some of mine, but I wanted to add on that the comprehensive plan amendments went to City Council for a study session on Tuesday night, and they were on, so far on board with many of them, but they did have concerns, as you did, with the CenturyLink / RV Park rezone, and their same concerns that you had were with the displacement of the people who are currently there. So we're going to see what we can do to provide them with more information. Their other concerns had to do with legacy landscaping, primarily with the environment and with sort of density and the community benefit for that. So that goes back to council on December 7th for action at that time. Our next meeting will be a public hearing on the Old Town Architectural Design Standards for Single Family Duplex. We should get our final, hopefully, draft of that next week, and then we'll review it, and then it will be posted and it will be out for review by the public and for you all. And as Commissioner Probola stated, we had interviews for our PPC members this week, and it was a really, really impressive and large group of applicants that we had, and it was kind of a struggle to pick, but we did find 3. They have all accepted. They will be appointed on December 7th, and then their start date will be January 1st. I didn't think that the architectural standards meeting would be the public hearing would be the best place to start, so they'll be starting on the 7th. And that concludes my report. Thank you.
So this is Madam Chair Probola. In regard to the interviews, they were all very good, and hopefully they will stay tuned and apply again for when there are openings in beginning January, February interview time, or even to look at some of the other commissions, because they are very well qualified individuals. And so at this time, I would like to find out from Doug or whoever is in the hot seat if there are anybody in the audience that would like to make a comment. Has anybody signed up?
This is Kristen Leeson, and no one has signed up. However, we do have Steve Pereira in the audience. Mr. Pereira, would you like to speak? Yes,
please. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So several thoughts, and I'll just put them out there, and I'll let you answer or determine whatever's next. First, thanks to Keith for his service to the city. 22 years is a long time. So thanks to him. Thanks to Andrea for stepping up and taking on what already seems like a large plate that she has filled. So I thought those both worth opening with. The next thought was on the agenda topics. There seems to be some intersectionality between the topics of this topic, which were ideological signs and directional signs and political signs and commercial signs. I'd like to better understand how those interact or where those interact. There are some businesses that people don't really like because they maybe have a faith-based motif, how that intersectionality interacts with the ideological signs versus commercial signs. Or maybe some people like the scouting organization because of the same reason, or how that would intersect with, let's say, a church or temple or mosque construction with an ideological sign, how that plays and interacts. That was my first thought. The second thought was, I think the city attorney doing the presentation talked about different cities have taken these different approaches on how wide of a approach that they're taking. I'd like to better understand maybe why or what are the benefits or the downfalls or downsides of each of those different approaches, whether it's a fine lens or a narrow lens or a medium lens. And the third thought, and just a comment, was that I would have liked to see the presentation included in what gets sent out. It's a fascinating topic, and I would have liked to better understand that. If somebody could forward that to me, please. But just going forward, if that can be included in the agenda for future presentations, just to help those of us better understand what's coming down the pike. Thank you all for your good work, and happy Thanksgiving.
Is there anybody else out there hidden somewhere that would like to speak?
There is no one else out there.
There are 3 Jones on my screen.
You know, one is on my phone. The other one is I got into, but my camera doesn't work. So you get more of me. What can I say? I do want to make one last comment since we were talking about interviews. I think the interviews, not the interviews, but the applications for the Environmental Council is still open. So if anybody is still interested, at least that's what I heard or saw. Lucy, are you checking that?
I'm sorry, say that again, Joan. I was making a note based on something else you said, and I stopped listening.
How could you do that?
I know.
Now, if anybody is still interested in applying for the Environmental Council, I think it's still open for a few days, but if you are interested, the application would be online. So please do check to see if it is still open.
I believe you're right, Madam Chair. I saw there are 2 boards that are open right now, and I saw the announcement within the last day or 2. So I believe you're correct that those positions are, those boards are still taking applications.
Okay, thank you. Is there any comment for the common good? Does anybody want to ask anything from staff? Nope. Okay. Hearing none, I'm going to close the meeting at 8:05. And thank you for your service. See you
Thank you,
on
everybody.